Hello and welcome to another year of EF Community Stand-Ups. I'm here with Jeremy and Shai, and we're going to talk this week about the EF survey that we did just before, at the end of last year. We asked almost 4,000 people, almost 4,000 people responded to a lot of questions that we asked about how you use EF Core, and Jeremy's going to go over the results of that survey for most of the session. Before we get started, let's do some of the standard things that we do at the beginning of each stand-up. So first off, we have the state of the unicorn. So the state of the unicorn this week is basically one thing, and that is we have the plan for EF Core 6 out there. So there's the plan is on our doc site, as is always the case. So that was the case for 5.0 as well. But we've also created, sorry, let me find the right screen here. We've also created a link to it on the issues page. So on the issues page on GitHub, you'll find that we have these three pinned issues: weekly updates, ideas for Git demos, and this stand-up, and then announcing the plan for EF Core 6.0. So this post is a brief summary of the things that we're planning for 6.0, the themes, which we have highly requested features, performance, migrations, improve existing stuff, some .NET integration, some experiments and investigations into some kind of more out there stuff. And we really want feedback on this. So come to this post. You can see down here, we've already got Eric and some other people commenting and adding feedback on there. So that's on GitHub. The full plan itself has more detail and is published to our doc site. So, you know, we've got a bit more detail with links to tracking issues, that kind of stuff on there. So go look there. Coming back to the state of the unicorn, let me just mention some of the things that people might be excited about. So like I said, We always do top requested community features. Two of the ones we're doing this time are temporal table support in SQL Server. This allows you to basically have system version tables handled by SQL Server, so you can go back and look at what the data was 10 weeks ago or whatever it is. And then JSON column support. Now, JSON column support is already in MPG SQL for Postgres and in the MySQL provider. We're bringing it to SQL Server and SQLite. And this, you can already map JSON columns and read and write from them fairly easily with a value converter, but this is to actually allow you to query into the JSON in the column. And that's kind of what makes it really interesting. We're doing a bunch of stuff around performance, including compiled models, which should help startup time, among other things. We're doing more work on migrations, including the bundles feature that was punted from 5.0. And some of the stuff that we found in the survey has fed into this plan already. Some of it is continuing to modify the plan. And one of the things that is very apparent is we need to get to complete query parity with EF6, meaning if you could translate the query on EF6, then you can translate it in EF Core 6. So that's the plan for 6.0. Take a look, give us your feedback. We also have got lots of new docs over the last few months, and I'm going to start a thing in the stand-up where we call out one of the new docs. In particular, I'm going to talk about the difference between DB context options, generic and non-generic. So let me switch back over to Edge here. So I'm in the docs page here, and I'm under DB context configuration initialization. This doc page has lots of good stuff about how you create context instances, how you do it in dependency injection, when you can use the factory. And one of the things that's people don't necessarily always know is when they should use the generic DB context, which is generic on your context type, and when they should just use the non-generic. The simple answer is most of the time you should always use the generic because it then ties the context options to that particular DB context type. And this means that if you're in DI, for example, you can resolve different options for different context type without there being any ambiguity. Now, if you only have one DB context registered in DI, it doesn't matter much, and you can resolve the non-generic one, and we allow that to work. But as soon as you have more than one, then you'll have to do it by the generic. And at the same time, if you actually want to have a context that is derived from by other contexts, then you should use the non-generic DB context in that one. So if you're writing a base context, which is essentially what DB context itself is, if you think about it, it's the base that you all derive your DB context from. If you're doing another base that you derive your context from, then in the same way that DB context is, you need to add the non-generic one. And that allows all of your contexts that have generic ones that derive from it to pass down into that same base constructor their context options. So lots of good tips and tricks in the documents like that. So go check them out. Lots of new stuff, and we'll call out one of these each time. I haven't been paying attention if there's been any comments or questions. So you guys.
Yeah, there was one question about JSON columns, and does this tie into the SQL Server JSON storage format?
Yes, that's the idea.
Yeah, the idea is for each like at the level of VF Core, for each provider to do whatever is the proper JSON support for that specific database, but for EF to provide some general abstractions and whatever.
Correct.
That's the idea.
Are we ready to look at our show links?
Sounds like a plan. Yeah, let's kick it off with the first one. If you want to click on it to open it up, we don't have to go through the whole article. This is a introduction to GraphQL for ASPNET Core. I included it here because it's pretty comprehensive, and I know GraphQL is something a lot of people are interested in. Hot Chocolate is a client that has been gaining traction recently. There's a few options for frameworks for .NET. This is one of those, but this is an article that will walk you through using it and kind of reveal what the benefits of using GraphQL are and why you would be interested in it as an API. And it ties a little bit into our plan for 6.0 as well. It's one of the things that isn't directly tied to Entity Framework Core, but is tied to the experience of data with .NET. Our team will be looking at GraphQL. Some people have already seen some of the public surveys that we sent out and questions we've asked about it, so that we can work to make it as best an experience as possible for .NET developers.
Awesome stuff. I'm looking forward to that. The next one is the Spotify data seed generator.
Yeah, that one's really cool. It's a very involved walkthrough, but in essence, what it'll do for you is it'll show you how to set up your developer API key with Spotify. And using that, it will go out and generate a project that has the classes defined, so likewise the database defined for that project, as well as seeding all the data. So it'll call out to the API, pull down all the information from that and seed it. So you get basically a fully functional application and database as a result, which is a pretty comprehensive walkthrough.
Awesome. That's really cool. I'm looking forward to looking at that some more. I'm a big Spotify user.
So before we jump to the next one, a question just came in. Is it possible that JSON mapping will work with JSON stored in varchar column?
I don't know enough about how SQL Server specifically defines JSON columns or not. So I'm not sure. Do you know, Shai, on Postgres or MySQL how it is?
So what I can tell you, mapping to JSON to a JSON is one thing, but then doing actual operations, for example, querying based on something inside that JSON column is very different. And that's not likely to work, obviously, for a varchar. So the whole point is if you put something in an actual JSON storage column in your database, SQL Server or Postgres, the whole point is usually that you can afterwards execute some sort of queries which are going to drill down into it. So if what you want is just to shove a JSON document into a varchar, you can do this today with value converters, and I don't think there's anything else that you need from us, basically, that could be done.
Yeah. So I think it's worth reiterating that you have been able to, for a while since EF Core 2x, basically store JSON in columns and have it automatically convert it to and from JSON when you read it in and out. So that the feature that we're looking at doing for EF Core 6.0 is, as Shai said, specifically about accessing the additional functionality when you tell SQL Server or your database system that this column is JSON and therefore has a certain structure and can be queried in a certain way.
Awesome.
Okay, so we go on to Entity Framework Core 5 free resources.
So someone that we may or may not know named Eric on his blog put together this nice link, and it's just links out to a ton of resources that you can go out to learn more about Entity Framework Core 5.
Yeah.
So thank you, really, Eric, for pulling all this together in one place.
Yeah, there's lots of videos, posts, everything on here. This is really great stuff, so definitely go check that out. Alice wants to be involved here. And then the YouTube Stand-Ups playlist.
Yeah, so we'll just include this link in every show. And someone asked if we can paste the link to the URL list if one of you can. I'm not logged into the sites, but we'll post that in. But this playlist will include it with each link, just so that if you want to review previous community stand-ups. And looking at this list, what started out as an idea, it looks like we've done quite a few shows already. So pretty excited to be in the first one of 2021.
Okay, I'm trying to figure out how to put this link up. Sorry, I'm not used to pushing the buttons here.
Oh, it is on under the description in YouTube. It should be, as I think in Twitch it may do that as well. There we go. So and it's posted out there.
Okay, so we've got it out there.
Yep.
Okay, so should we move on to the survey?
Let's do that.
Okay.
All right. So this is, I'm going to take total credit for the design of the title screen of this, the EF Core 6.0. Actually, PowerPoint has some nice graphics for this. So what I thought I'd do is breakdown, we asked a lot of questions, had a lot of insights and data. So what we're going to do is walk through, talk a little bit about the responses that we had. And then if you have questions, please go ahead and ask those questions to chat. This is meant to be an interactive conversation. And before I jump into sort of the responses that tell us a little bit about you, thank you to everyone who participated in the survey. Incredibly valuable for us. Almost 4,000 developers responded, which was just a phenomenal response rate. So we're very thankful for that feedback. So the first qualifier, if I will, about who answered is level of database experience. So we asked these questions. So we had 227 respond that they are actually a database administrator working with EF Core. And then the majority say you are comfortable writing table definitions and stored procedures, not necessarily database admin level. So it's interesting to us to understand the level of expertise you have working with EF Core. And we can also look at things like, for people with less experience, what are the important features versus people with more experience? I don't know. Any other thoughts on these results?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question, of course, because whether or not somebody is an expert or how they answer these questions will depend a lot on what their perception of being a database administrator is, for example. So it's a little hard to put concrete conclusions from this, but I think it shows that we have people across a variety of experiences using EF Core. So it's important that we recognize that, we need the power features and it needs to be simple, which, validates our approach going forward. So it's definitely good to get that.
Yeah, and I like the solid response with, I could be a DBA, but I like writing code. So.
Yes.
All right, this one is another one that was not a big surprise to us. We know a lot of EF Core developers are on the Windows platform, but there is a very solid showing kind of split between around 5% for Mac and Linux. And some of these, well, this is primary, but I'm sure there's some overlap too. We had some other responses that said, I work on all three, or Linux and Windows as well.
It is interesting here, to me at least, that Mac and Linux are so close, because historically Mac has been a much bigger developer platform than Linux. So I think for people like Shai and I who do develop on Linux, this is kind of interesting to see Linux catching up a little bit.
Yep.
Now this one comes with a little bit of a caveat that I'll explain. So primary development environment. It's interesting that Visual Studio Code is gaining traction, but it's kind of neck and neck with Writer. And by far the major share is Visual Studio, but it's not a surprise if you go to Linux or Mac and you look at just people who are primarily on those systems, then Visual Studio Code becomes 40% of the responses. And I think Writer was similarly close in responses there.
Yep.
So that is just a little bit about our respondents. So let's talk about EF Core. First, big question we asked is, what apps are you using EF Core in? And, no surprise, if you're exposing data on the web, you're probably doing it through a web API. And so the number one is ASP.NET Core Web API. That's followed by MVC or Razor, so integrating data within your app experiences. And then a lot of console and background services, which surprised me a little bit at the many responded there, because I think of it a lot as a interactive kind of application tool. That's how I've used it in the past. But we had that, and then falling off to WPF, down to WinForms, and on up to Uno being the smallest usage from respondents.
I mean, I guess it may be worth mentioning, if you put together WPF and WinForms and the rest of the, the UI frameworks, then you do get something, because I was a bit initially surprised to see console background service like you so high up. But then that's one thing, whereas the UI frameworks, the non-web ones, are kind of spread across multiple things, right?
Yeah. It's
Go ahead.
And I was just going to say it's an overlap as well. So we had, select all that apply. So some people are working in multiple environments.
Yeah. So, I mean, from the beginning of EF Core, ASP.NET Core has been our most important segment of customers. And in addition to the survey showing that we have, telemetry from Visual Studio and things like that also validate that. But we never intended to, it was always intended to be cloud and mobile. So we've always been tracking against the UI frameworks and the different platforms like that. And it's great to see some of those getting traction. It's also going to be interesting to see where that whole space ends up as, and where we end up supporting which UI platforms tend to be the most used. But yeah, it's Blazor being in there, I think, is also obviously kind of a crossover between those two things. You're doing ASP.NET Core, but it's much more using EF in a way similar to a UI platform as well. So this validates basically what we thought we knew, but it's still interesting to see all those other platforms that people don't necessarily traditionally think about as being important for EF Core.
Yeah, and I'm interested in drilling in too, because I'm assuming the Blazor WebAssembly usage is talking to a web API that then uses EF Core, but it'd be interesting if people are actually, because I believe right now the only two scenarios, and one you have to hack really hard, right, to get to work, is SQLite in the browser and Cosmos DB in the browser.
Yeah. So question from Julie here. Will we be sharing these slides?
And the answer is yes. We'll find a home forum on the docs page with a link, and I will tweet out and LinkedIn out and all the other channels. We'll basically link to it from our docs and make that available after the show.
Yep.
Okay, what version of Entity Framework are you using? So this is, again, not much of a surprise at the time of the survey. EF Core 5 was still in preview, and so 696 for that. Vast majority on EF Core 3X. Interestingly, second place EF6 on .NET Framework, and this for the team is interesting to us just to understand, what is keeping people from migrating onto the new platform. And whether it's because in some cases it's challenges with .NET Framework API surface area, in some cases it's challenges with EF Core API surface area. So, and we drill into that in some of the other questions. But I guess the surprise for us was this pre-Entity Framework 6, EF4, EF5 Classic. That's a pretty solid number of people working on those legacy applications.
Yeah, that was really surprising to me to see that many people basically using stuff that is not, EF5 is 10 years old now or something like that. I mean, it's been out there a while, and we hardly ever see anybody ask questions on these things. We don't get support requests coming through on these things. So we basically don't hear from anybody pretty much who's using these versions, and yet 334 of you are. And so that was kind of surprising to us. So yeah, hopefully we can drill into it. If you are using pre-Entity Framework 6, let us know. Contact us, and we'd like to talk to you and understand why.
Sounds good. So this is migrations. This question was, have you done it? Have you migrated from EF6 to EF Core? And 80% have not, but 20%, which is a pretty solid number, have done that migration. Now, we also drilled into biggest challenges for migration, and that is information for us to better understand as we roll out future versions, how to make that less painful, more seamless, and improve that experience. I didn't summarize the data because it's free form here for the purposes of this call, but we did follow up with, actually we did have the challenges slide. So So it looks like missing features, which is kind of a catch-all, right? We tried to ask for specific features, but we didn't want to lead the witness too much, right, for that. So, but to me, it's pretty solid that a 20% response rate had no issues, right? They just said they migrated and they were done. And then we have queries, relationships, migrations, and 5% said GUI was the challenge, which I'm assuming kind of overlaps with the whole EDMX file issue as well, right?
Yes, there's been some comments on not having EDMX files. I mean, just to, we theoretically, it would be possible to take an EDMX file and create a code first model out of it. And, we talked about that with Diego years and years ago when we started EF Core. The reason we've never done that is because we actually think it's a better experience to start with your database that you've mapped your EDMX file to, reverse engineer that, and get your EF Core model from that. Now, neither is going to be perfect, but in terms of writing all of the code to kind of generate EF Core from EDMX, the value of that over just using your database doesn't seem to be super high to us. Stepping back a little further than that, just so people are aware, EF Core doesn't have EDM, the entity data model, which is the EDM part of EDMX. It's not based on that like EF6 is. EF6 is fundamentally based around that whole model file. One of the points of EF Core was not to be limited by the EDM model. And so it's not it's not just, oh, we don't like XML files or whatever. It's like it's a fundamental difference between EF Core and EF6.
So for those considering migration, we had the vast majority, 60% not considering, a 28% no concerns. So I'm considering doing it, don't have concerns. There were things listed like just waiting for approval. There's other testing or issues we have to deal with that's not EF Core related. And then there were 12% that said, yeah, we're considering it, but we do have blocks and concerns. And those are summarized here.
So this is definitely one of those things that is already feeding into our planning. I think you can see, features not yet. It's like features not yet addressed, and that includes things like the missing group by support that we still have in 5.0. And so that's kind of one of the reasons that we are making EF6 query parity an important part of the EF Core 6.0 plan, because based on this feedback, even though we're pretty close now, that's one of the things that's stopping you. And we'll need your help on that as well, because we'll try and cover everything. But if you find a query that doesn't translate after we say, hey, we've done it all in this preview, then let us know so that we can add that in, because it's not a trivial task to figure out what that set of queries is. It's very untrivial, if I can put it that way.
So it was interesting too, because this was a free-form response, so it took some time to go through and categorize and crunch the numbers. But a lot of the features that were listed are in that 24% spot, which were things like mini to mini and table per type. And so it's exciting to me, at least, to see that at least some of those blockers were addressed by moving to EF Core 5.
Agreed. So one thing I just want to, since we were talking about EDMX a minute ago, Eric is saying use the EF Power Tools to get it up to speed quickly. If you come from EDX, I would totally say, yep, do that. That will get you there quick. So thanks, Eric.
And that's, it's probably another thing to highlight, excuse me, too, is that as an open source project, one of the things is we're not trying to solve every problem with EF Core. And there are some great community projects and contributions out there. And an example of that is the EF Core Power Tools. A lot of the features that people are looking for in EF Core that are implemented in the baseline package are implemented through those Power Tools. And there's not a compelling reason to take that over, right? It's there, it's working. We support it we don't support it personally, but I gotta be careful with my language. But we're fans of it.
We love it. We just like it. Yeah.
So All right, so this slide was the response. One of the things that's important to us as we come out with new releases is we can write tests and we can test to a certain level, but you're really the ones who have the business cases and scenarios and problem domain. And using previews and release candidates is a way to get defects and changes to us quickly so that we can put it into the final release. And we noticed that there's just not much use of daily builds and previews. We wanted to get some feedback on what people use. And so by far, the majority are using the release versions. What's interesting is second place is people who will only use long-term support releases as well. And then it drops off to release candidate preview and dailies.
Yeah, this was really interesting. I mean, if you follow me on Twitter, you especially, when we get to the previews before releases, you'll hear me going on and on and on about trying the previews, because anybody who tries the previews and files issues on that helps us so much. One of the things that we did well in 5.0, much better than we've done before, and that's have a proper release candidate. And I think the data here backs up why we tried to do that, and I think it helped. And that is, and by proper release candidate, I don't mean we're still working on everything and we've just designated this preview as RC1, which, to be honest, has been what's happened a bunch of Microsoft stuff, in the past, including EF Core. For 5.0, the release candidate was feature complete. So it was basically anything you want is in here, and anything that's broken is a bug, and we'll try and fix bugs. But you're not getting we're still working on this kind of release. So even if you're not ready to do, and the other thing about release candidates is they have a go live license. So effectively what that means is it's supported. So the point of all this is, even if you're not going to do previews, and I can understand there's reasons why it's a pain to do previews, although we try and make it as easy as possible, same with dailies, but even if you're not going to do those, when the release candidate comes out for EF Core 6.0, it'll be feature complete. I'll commit to that now, and I'm going to eat those words, aren't I? But I've committed to that now. Try it, because it really helps to get solid, stable releases out there.
Yeah, I also have a comment on this. So as Arthur said, the previews are extremely important, and we're actually gonna start so the first preview is gonna come out at some point this month already. So we're very early in the 6.0 release cycle, but we're already gonna have like a first preview of 6.0. And one thing I'm going to do like a marketing pitch here. The one thing I think people maybe don't realize, maybe we don't communicate it well enough, is that the preview that gets released for EF Core or any other of the .NET things has basically gone through the same, verification in terms of the CI pipeline. The same tests have, it passed all of our test suite in the exact same way. So previews are not, sometimes people think that a preview is like some sort of, unstable alpha version that might work and might not, and so on. And in fact, what we try to make people understand that it's gone through the same kind of thing. We definitely do not release a preview that has any sort of known instability or bug. It may not, it's not going to have all the features, obviously, of 6.0 because we haven't gotten around to it. But in terms of stability, if you're open to that, then you should see a level of stability that's not very, very far from a release or from an RC. And yeah, I hope everybody listening to this will kind of, take it into account that it's there. And the other thing that's related to this, so we release now pretty much once a year, right, in November. Previews are a way to actually get those new features in between, right? Because a year could be a little bit long. So it is an option. I'm just saying, of course, not everybody can use a preview in their production platform, and that's not necessarily even that recommended, but it is something that you can do, and we're going to support it. If you find a bug, we're going to fix it, and the fix is going to be there in the next preview. So take that into account.
So one from the comments, just one thing before we go on to the next one. There's a lot of people discussing database first versus code first. I'm pulling up one of these. The DB is a source of truth for everything, so the switch for code first is not that easy to sell. So code first is a really bad name. It was a marketing term that they, they created when we had database first and model first, and I'm like, oh, code first, that fits nicely. Code first doesn't mean you write your code first. It doesn't even mean that the code is the source of the truth. It just means that the mappings that you might have had in an XML file like EDMX are now written in C# code. Those mappings can be driven from the database using EF Core power tools that Eric has, or using the reverse generator. It's not great at keeping those up to date. There's stuff we need to work on that. To be fair, if you've used update model from database in the EF designer, that doesn't work properly either. So it's not that much different. And the point here is you don't have to completely change your way of thinking about the database to use EF Core just because the models are in code. And I think that's important for people to understand.
Yeah, I like when in my consulting days, when we would talk about entity framework, I like to talk about code first and database first, but the reality is in between, right? So yes. I don't want to just create a nice domain model and code and generate my database from that. I don't want to create a nice database and just naively generate code from that. I want to model the domain properly, model the database properly, and then use that Fluent API to map the two together in the right way. That's why it's a object relational mapper, right? So, yeah. Okay, let's move on. So how you use EF Core. So this was a question of which technologies you use in conjunction with Entity Framework Core. Obviously, a lot of people are serializing JSON over the wire. So Newtonsoft.json and systemtext.json had strong showings. ASPNET Core Identity is scaffolds by default with Entity Framework Core. So those two kind of go hand in hand. And then we've got AutoMapper and Dapper. So AutoMapper, obviously taking one type of entity, mapping it to another. Maybe you have data transfer objects versus rich business objects, etc. But the Dapper use was interesting because this was specifically in use with EF Core. So I don't know. And then we have EF Power Tools, which we talked about.
I think one point about the Dapper thing, we sometimes still see this kind of discussion. Should I use EF Core or Dapper, or which is best, or that kind of discussion? And people kind of, so a lot of very, very serious people, if I'm not mistaken, including the Stack Overflow people, for example, do use these two technologies together, and you use each one of them where that makes sense, right? So if you have some sort of perf concern with EF on a specific point, nothing's stopping you from taking Dapper and using it for that specific thing. It should never be some sort of ideological thing. And even, I mean, we don't, as a team, we try hard to never ever, we don't push for EF Core to be the answer for all of your data needs. There's other technologies out there that are completely fine. So I'm very happy to see that kind of thing, actually.
Yeah, me too. I mean, there's a bit of debate on the team as to whether or not we should invest in features that are quote unquote better done by Dapper, things like raw SQL queries and stuff like that. I think the consensus on the team is we want to have good support for those, even though Shai thinks maybe we shouldn't. Just because we don't want to force people to say, oh man, I have to go and use something else and I don't want an additional dependency. That being said, like Shai said, Stack Overflow uses Dapper primarily for queries and EF Core primarily for updates. That works really well for them. And I've seen other people doing that, and it's a good way to go.
This is a list. I won't spend too much time on it unless there's anything that jumps out to the team to mention. But in the other section, these are the ones we didn't present as options and came out as very commonly selected items. Obviously, bulk extensions, right? Bulk and batch operations is asked for quite a bit. But when this is posted, these links will be available. Some of these tools may be useful to people who are missing some functionality that they believe should be in EF Core, but is addressed by a community project. This can help out with that.
Absolutely. And we have a list of extensions on the EF Core page, which basically anybody can send a pull request to. So we don't necessarily say that these are all great extensions, but there's a significant list of things that you can use with EF Core there as well. So, do take a look at those. And if you've got something that you've written and you've put it up on GitHub, then, send us a link and we'll add it there. People might find it useful as well.
This next one is one in retrospective. We could have probably asked differently. We're curious about multiple databases in the same application. There's two things. I'm on SQL Server, for example, and I have two databases that I'm accessing, so probably two different DB contexts. You can certainly have more. And then I'm using Azure Cosmos DB and SQL Server in the same one. But based on other answers, there's a lot of usage of the in-memory provider, we presume, for testing. And I think that maybe a lot of people said, oh, yeah, we use the in-memory and we use the SQL, or we use the SQL Server and the SQLite. So this is one of the ones we're going to follow up and drill a little deeper to understand what this multiple database use is.
Yeah, I think one of the things we learned from this is how to do better next time we do a survey, which is whenever you get into something like a complex survey like this, and then you send it out, and then you get a question back, and you're like, well, did we really ask what we meant to be asked? And then, I don't think we did, so learning experience, like everything.
I have to say one thing. There was actually specifically a bug, and there's a bug that's going to be fixed in EF Core 503 that happened when you had SQL Server and Postgres together, like NPG SQL together. And I remember when I first saw this bug, I was kind of like, how many people are there out there actually using those two providers together, right? The hypothesis I had naturally assumed or intuited was that people typically use just a single database. And in fact, we got quite a big amount of people saying, yeah, this is a problem for me too, which is the exact same thing that we want to get a signal on from this kind of question. So It's always interesting for us how many people actually, this touches upon many, many areas of EF Core. Migrations get complicated or have a spin when you have to do them across two databases. It's not the same as when you want to do them on one database. So it's a pretty fundamental question for us.
It is.
Priority of EF Core provider. So this one we asked of the existing providers that are available, rank them in importance. And then we summarized based on a weighted score and map that out. And so first place was SQL Server, which is the same provider for Azure SQL Database. Then we had PostgreSQL, we had in-memory, SQLite, and on down the list there. I don't think there were any surprises, really.
There were no surprises. There's no surprises here. I think the team continues to be surprised how many people use the in-memory database for testing, which I perhaps already mentioned. But no, this matches. Matches what we expect, and I think it's great that we have really good open source providers for Postgres and MySQL. Obviously the SQLite and SQL Server ones, the team ships those, but the MySQL and Postgres are community projects, and they're as high quality or more than the ones we ship, and that's great to see.
Let's see. So in-memory provider use, we really wanted to understand this use. At one point the team was considering, do we keep moving forward, right, with the in-memory provider, and everyone came back and said yes. keep going. So 65% use it or are considering it for testing, which is what we hypothesized would be the main usage scenario. 20% don't use it and aren't even considering it, so it's just off the chart. And then you have 12%, so 1 in 10 said, I'm using it for testing and I'd like to use it in production. That's another one of those follow-ups that is, why do you want to use in-memory in production?
It's very interesting, because from the beginning with the in-memory database, it was explicitly not a goal to make this a high-performing in-memory database. And indeed, it is not a high-performing in-memory database. It's a very poorly performing in-memory database. It's exceptionally useful to the team for testing, and so it's not like it doesn't have value. Apparently, it's exceptionally, it's very useful to other people as well. But it's never been designed as a production in-memory database. Never. So that is very interesting to us.
We have 59 people to follow up with who are using it in production to understand what that scenario actually looks like. So, okay, priority for missing providers. Now, this was the one that was very, very interesting to me. We asked of providers that aren't yet written, which ones are most important to you to write? In other words, which one do you feel is missing that you really want to use? And the top two were MongoDB, which is a document store similar to Azure Cosmos DB. It may be referring to the MongoDB API for Azure Cosmos DB. That's a possibility as well. And then CSV and Excel was number two. Azure Storage, more features for the Azure Cosmos DB provider, and then it drops off from there. We did analyze, we had an open-ended kind of other response, and we analyzed those, but there wasn't anything significant that stood out. So
it's certainly interesting that CSV Excel is so high on the list there, and I would like to. I mean, there's obviously ways you can think of. Oh, maybe I could import my data, as a starting point from an Excel or a CSV, and I can see that as something that would be useful. Having a provider implies more than that. It implies that you're going to be able to update and query the CSV Excel directly, and that's a little confusing to me. I'm not quite sure what people want when that means. So again, if you've got ideas about how you would use it, reach out, because I'm not saying that it wouldn't be great, and maybe we're just missing a really cool integration point that would just make it super useful for people doing big data or whatever to get their data into a database, and then and that kind of stuff. So I don't know. Let us know.
Yeah. They're definitely interested in some of these. I wonder, is it just link support for that data source? I just want to be able to query it, or is it truly I want the whole context, concurrency, like?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, if it is just about querying, I hope people are also aware it's relatively trivial to have some sort of IEnumerable, like read in a CSV as an IEnumerable, and then you have the whole power of link. It's pretty much not far away from what EF Core would provide had we implemented some sort of provider. But where it gets really interesting, I completely agree with Arthur, is if people are actually looking for updating, which is interesting.
So I'll go on a really fast tangent, and I promise I won't spend too long, but .NET Interactive, Jupyter Notebook support for C#, both of those allow you to use, there's a utility that they had called Linkify, which basically allows you to import a CSV or a comma separator tab delimited file and call one method that you just tell it basically turn this into a column store. I do have a header, I don't have a header, and then you can run link queries interactively across it. So very useful tool.
Yeah, and I think something similar that lets you get it into just a relational database or whatever would be useful, but that's a different thing from provider. So
production database hosting. Oh, go ahead.
Before we move on, there's a lot of comments have been going by about the performance of Dapper versus EF Core. And I'm not going to go over all of the comments. There's been some good responses and links there, but I will say it ties in with our EF Core 6.0 plan. So one of the items in the EF Core 6.0 plan is to be as fast as Dapper on the Tech and Power Fortunes benchmark. So one place where one of the questions was the difference between raw SQL, Dapper, and EF Core. So one place you can see that, and there's a link in the EF Core 6.0 plan, so you can go find it there. But you'll find that there are various flavors of that benchmark, and this is the Tech and Power Fortunes benchmark is kind of an industry standard. I am updating. Is that just reading, Shai?
That's just a reading benchmark. Exactly.
It's
It's worth mentioning. It's one of a set of Tech and Power benchmarks, and there are others for updating as well.
So we run those with a variety of flavors, and the EF Core ones are generally the slowest. I'm going to say that now. They're not super slow by any means, but they're slower than if I just use Dapper for that. And Dapper is significantly slower than if I handcraft all my ADO and just do everything like super fast. So that's where on that one, we're like way up on the fortunes. Like I can't remember where we are, but we're top 10 or something, aren't we now, Shai?
Yeah. I think we were we're supposed to be 7th place now after .NET 5 and all the improvements.
Yeah. So in EF Core 6.0, we're going to try and get the EF Core performance on queries at least for Fortunes, up to that of Dapper. We won't achieve that. It's not going to be possible because EF Core is a very different beast. However, because it's a different beast, we may be able to do things that Dapper doesn't do, and so we'll see how it goes. But we're going to make a really big effort to make it faster.
And just a quick shout out to our Twitch stream comments. We do see Twitch stream. I did not see a specific question, so if there's one you feel we missed, go ahead and throw that out there again. But we do monitor both Twitch and YouTube. I know there's some discussions that we're not following the platform, so I did not notice a question there. But I'm
looking at all of them. Unfortunately, it's hard to pull out all of the questions and answer them. Some of them, especially if they're ones that really need an issue on GitHub, to go into it in detail. So anyway, we're doing our best.
Yeah, I hear fingers flying on the keyboard, so that's in action. So production database hosting, this one, you have to kind of look at it two ways, because we were very specific about some Microsoft properties, which because we're Microsoft. So for example, we were interested in, if you're on Azure, are you just lifting and shifting, like dropping it in as a VM? Or are you actually using SQL as a service? Or are you containerizing your application? And then we had on-premise. But if you summarize all of this, basically you'll see that there's a pretty even split between on-premise and cloud-based, which is a big shift. I'm still, I've been doing this for quite some time, so I still have kind of that old school mindset, assuming everyone's on-premise and not running, as many people running production in the cloud, but they came up very close together, and it's a split across different providers. And we definitely had a good list of other providers that we did not include in the survey that we went through as well. How do you deploy your changes to production? This one is always intriguing for me. The winner was run as part of application at startup. And second was generate and run a script manually. And third was I don't. And this is one we talked about in the EF Core 6 plan. Running as part of application as startup is not necessarily the best practice, especially if you're in a distributed environment, right? If you have multiple nodes that are running. So what we want to do is make EF Core extremely friendly for cloud native, for distributed, for mobile, for all of these different experiences. And so we want to have, like, in the future, maybe number one be a migration bundle or something specific to that event of migrating. But any other thoughts around this from the team?
I think again, this backs up what we gathered from other sources, so it's good. This is on us to make it easier to not run them at startup. Bryce has been heavily thinking about that, and we're looking at it for 6.0.
Though I have to say, even before 6.0, if this is something that you do, I mean, it can work and it's fine, but we really do recommend you go check out our docs. We have some sections explaining the exact differences between these different techniques, and just be sure you understand exactly, how this kind of stuff works. We do really recommend using SQL scripts for production databases.
Yeah, and Shai updated the migrations documentation recently. So if you've seen it, a year ago, go look at it again. It's much more helpful, a lot more information there, lots of examples.
Yeah, I'm just going to call out and say the whole team has been working very hard to update the documentation across the board. There's major updates to understanding migrations, change tracker, and other features, the new DB Context Factory, the options, everything. So definitely, if you haven't visited the docs recently, there are a lot of updates and a lot deeper content for you.
So I've specifically been on the team like for 2 years now, not that long, but we've never had such a spurt, as far as I remember, of docs writing. So we've added some major sections and rewrote some things. So it really is worth checking out.
Absolutely.
Scaffold and migrations. We asked you, how do you scaffold and migrate? And 16% of you said, I don't. Okay, easy enough. 41% CLI, .NET EF, which is where you get the nice ASCII unicorn, which is my favorite ASCII art. And then, Yeah, that's my whole takeaway from our command line tool, right? And then 30% use the package manager console, which is really the same thing as the CLI, just different words and verbs, right? From the NuGet package manager.
It has. So we used to say, if you're on Visual Studio, use the PMC because it integrates with the Visual Studio project system, which can make it a slightly better experience on Visual Studio. I have to say, though, really just use whichever one you're comfortable with because I think both of them give an awesome experience, and it's just a matter of, like you say, which kinds of nouns and verbs you want to type and whether they're uppercase or not.
Yeah. It's like going from Bash to PowerShell, right?
Yeah.
So.
And 9% of EF Power Tools. That's pretty amazing. Eric has 9%.
More people should be using the EF Power Tools. That should be higher.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we might have a follow-on episode talking specifically about migrations again and some of the tools and options out there.
Yeah.
Not that I just signed this up for a future episode, but I think
We've got
I did.
plenty of things. Add it to the list.
All right, so this is one of the forward-looking questions. We said basically, what tools do you need to be successful that we don't have in EF Core? And we get this request quite a bit, which is a data visualization tool to be able to see the database model, to visualize it. Some of this may be actually asking for EDMX support. Some of it may say, no, it's we understand the EDM format's not part of EF Core, but we still want to visualize. Then we've got second place, that right-click gesture for commands. So instead of going to the CLI or the NuGet package manager, be able to manipulate, for example, migrations from directly within Visual Studio and or Visual Studio Code. None of the above. There were a lot of other answers, data binding wizard. And then, I'm sorry, none of the above was, hey, we're happy. You don't need to add anything. And then there were 200 that said, yeah, there is something else, and I'm going to add that. So.
Yeah, so it's worth calling out here, especially on the visualization. There's some open source projects, community projects out there. I think Bryce added them to our extensions list. So look in the docs page on the EF extensions list, and you'll see them there. So there are things out there, and some of them are being actively developed, some not so much, but it's worth checking those out and seeing if that's something you could use. I think also we've talked since the beginning of since EF 4.1 basically about the right click. Actually, no, it wouldn't have been 4.1, would it? Because 4.1 didn't have migrations. But the first release that had migrations, I think, was 4.3. And this isn't core. This is back in the pre-core days. We talked about right-click gestures for commands, and I still think that will be a useful thing and or something that somebody should do. I think the PowerShell does some of this. Bryce and I have talked, and we should talk to Eric about this, about whether or not it's putting things in the places where people expect them. And I think we need to dig into the experience a bit more. But I think this could be something that either the Power Tools or some other community project takes on, and we get a Vizix out there in the Visual Studio Gallery that has a good experience for this. It seems doable by the community to me, and we would definitely be willing to help you.
Yeah, we had a question about the data binding wizard. That's actually something that existed in previous versions in WPF and WinForms, and I believe has come back to WPF on .NET Core. But the idea is basically you can point to a data context, and it will automatically introspect the entities on that database context, and then you can drag and drop on your designer. You basically drag contacts onto a grid, and you've data bound the data in that to the grid, is what that wizard is. Yeah,
the data binding experience is something that has come back to the front in the last couple of years, both with WPF and WinForms, and also with Blazor now, and other UI frameworks. But those three have been driving a lot of things. So some of that is about making what we have now work really well, but I think we're also looking for ways that we could improve that experience, the data binding experience in general. And I know the WinForm teams is also interested in that, so it'll be interesting to see where that goes, because there's good potential there.
One more note for me, just really quickly about the data visualization thing. So there is sometimes this tendency in the .NET ecosystem to expect or to want all tools to come from Microsoft. It's like a general thing that we sometimes see. And I think specifically in this domain, so there are definitely tools not coming from Microsoft that can fulfill people's general needs. So the power tools have already been mentioned here. We also had Franz Buma, who's the author, the owner of LLBL Gen Pro, which is exactly that. So a data visualization tool that you can use with EF Core. So these are things that are complementary to EF Core and take care of that specific thing that is missing for certain people. So the general message is don't necessarily expect or look for everything on a Microsoft site. You're going to find it elsewhere as well, and it's going to be just as good.
That's a good point, and I've been talking about community and open source projects, but there's also commercial things out there, not just Franz's. There's other ones out there as well,
right?
And some of them have, from what I understand, fairly decent support for designers and things like that. So yeah, check those out.
Okay, a quick section on Azure Cosmos DB taking the R out of ORM, right? It's not a relational data store. So the first thing we asked is adoption. And 53%, so more than half, don't work with it, don't plan to. Next, 1 in 3 don't work with it, but are considering it. It'll be interesting to see what the factors of that consideration are. 1 in 10 work with it, but don't use our provider. And then 4% work with and use the provider. So this is interesting because there's a small fraction that actually reported using the provider, but there's a much larger percentage who reported that provider being important, which leads us to believe there are some major feature gaps, right? That part of the EF6 plan is to identify what the most important feature gaps are so that we can invest in improving that provider for it.
Yeah, so again, we know. I mean, this isn't something we didn't know in terms of the feature gaps. So we knew about the feature gaps. What we have got from this is a very clear signal that people want us to work on those feature gaps and that Cosmos is important. And so that's been very useful. Hopefully, as Jeremy said, we can drill down into now what specific feature gaps we should tackle. And it's not as simple as saying, well, the ones most people vote for, right? Because the issue with the Cosmos provider being a non-relational database is we're not going to try and make it work really well to do what a relational database does. That's not the point. The point is the EF Core provider should do what Cosmos does well. And so when you look at things like include support, if that would involve doing something really expensive on Cosmos, it's not necessarily the best feature to put, even if people think they want it, and so it really is a matter of really figuring out what are the ways that people can use EF Core with Cosmos that is effective and both cost effective and effective in terms of the programming model and the experience and everything. And that's actually fairly challenging. So that's why digging more into the responses on this and reaching out to people I think is going to be very useful.
Yeah, and this just further clarifies the use and shows that 1 in 10 would or are using the provider. 8% say they would use it if it had the features they needed, and then 3% are actively using it. So that's it's significant, 1 in 10 respondents, and we definitely want to address that. So we are at the last section of the survey. I know we're at the top of the hour, but I think we'll have time to go through these final few items. The first one is your biggest EF Core performance challenges. This is another one of those questions that we may not have asked the best way, because query, which is the #1 response, is also the one that's probably the most open-ended. Like, what part of it is the challenge? Is it support for it? Is it aggregates? Is it includes projections, materialization? There's so many aspects to this that we could drill into, but these are the main responses that we saw.
I think what's interesting on this, to me especially, is not so much that query is high, but that initialization of the DB context and model building is not also up there, because we know, and EF Core 6.0 plan has compiled models in there, which is basically to address this. I mean, there's a lot of things that compiled models touches. But initialization of the context, if you're, for example, on Xamarin and you have a big model, that's slow right now. And so it's kind of interesting that this isn't higher than it is. And I think maybe that's because, for people who have really big models, these things become problematic, and we understand that, and that's why we try and do things like compiled models. But I think it also emphasizes that a lot of people use EF Core with relatively small models, and by small I don't mean 2 entities, I mean 100 or so, entity types, and they don't really have an issue with initialization and model building with those types, and that's really good to see, and somewhat validates that we didn't focus too much on that stuff rather than some of the other things that we had to focus on.
Okay, moving on to the next one, mobile challenges. So this one surprised me because I've worked with people using EF Core on mobile, and there are issues with startup time. There's some issues with when you see the linker flags, which was the least reported. That's because of some of the optimizations aren't translated the way that, for example, iOS, right, won't allow us to dynamically generate code, so it goes through an interpreter, so it's actually slower for code that's meant to be faster. But what blew my mind was really the problem that people seem to want solved is this synchronization, this offline, when I'm disconnected, keeping the database in sync, which is was eye-opening to me.
It's it's always been there, right? The synchronization has been a mobile challenge forever, and there's been various attempts to bridge that gap. Some less successful and some more successful. It's not trivial, I mean, we've thought about this for a long time, and we have various ideas of things we could do, and clearly it's something that longer term we need to look into. But it's definitely not. It's not a trivial thing by any means.
We had somebody here on the show. If you guys want to look at our archives, .NET MIM was like a solution for doing precisely this. But yeah, it's a super difficult problem to solve in a general way for everybody, of course.
It's a shame that she had to leave because I was going to say under the other, Julie Lerman was one of the top mentioned sources of solutions. But this is how developers address issues. We want to know you run into a problem, what are you doing? And vast majority search for it on Stack Overflow. But a bunch of you use your favorite search engine. You Google, Bing, Lycos, AltaVista, Dogpile. Okay, so that'll be out of context. And then only a third place is searching for the issue on the GitHub repo. Has someone run into this and already filed it? And then fourth place is looking at the local logs, which is if you haven't looked at EF Core logs, you should start looking at them because they are incredibly detailed. They don't just tell you what problems you're having, but they will indicate problems you might have based on the way that you're configuring the application or the way you're constructing a query. You'll actually get tips. Go ahead.
Sometimes your logs will even tell you how to solve your problem, which is especially nice. So
right.
Yeah. So one of the challenges that any runtime component as opposed to tooling component has is, what do we do when we encounter a case where you might be right, but you also could easily have got it wrong? And this is a place where compilers and other other development time tools spit warnings out, right? They're like, okay, well, are you sure you meant to use equals instead of equals there? You might mean that, but we think you probably didn't. So we have a bunch of cases like that in EF Core, and what we do, and it isn't ideal, but it's better than nothing, is we put warnings out into the log. And so even if you're only running your logs with a level warning, it's great to look at those. And if you have warnings in there, to go and look at them and say, okay, do I really know what I'm doing here? Did I really mean this? And that can really help you from going down rabbit holes of not understanding what's going wrong. So definitely look at those logs. And also, you can just, once you've figured it out, if you're like, no, that's cool, I meant to do that, then you can set the warning up to be ignored, and so you won't get continually bothered by it. But as Jeremy said, go look at the logs.
That is the last piece of this that I have to share with you. We will get this posted out for reference. We do have the EF6 plan published. And another thing is, for those questions that we may not have asked as well as we could have or should have, we will be following up. So look to see either another survey or some contact from the team. But we definitely want to hear from you so that we can do things like prioritize those Azure Cosmos DB features or understand why you want to use an in-memory provider in production.
So just to add a little bit to that, so somebody says use EF help on Twitter. So yes, that can work. Twitter is not necessarily the easiest place to answer questions. So to call out again, the place where the team looks, that's where I look and Shai and everybody else on the team, is on GitHub. So feel free to ask questions on EF Core GitHub repo or file bugs as well, obviously. Lots of people on Stack Overflow. Stack Overflow is a great place to answer. The community is strong there, and I'm pretty sure Bryce, unless he's changed his MO, hangs out in Stack Overflow and answers questions there. So that's really good. And then look in the docs as well. I like we said, the docs have been updated a lot recently. But even when we sent the survey out, people like the docs a lot, and so go look in the docs. That's a great way. It's a great way to find us. And then of course, ping us on Twitter, and we'll probably tell you go ask on GitHub. But anyway. Okay,
that's all I got.
I think that's all we have. We've run a bit over, so we're going to have another one of these in 2 weeks, and I think we'll see you all then. So bye for now.
Sounds good. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate you.
Thanks for watching.